The Watcher Ending Explained. This latest release on Netflix was a really interesting one. Inspired by the true events that occurred, The Watcher was a haunting watch that focused on a family receiving letters after moving into a newly acquired property that was their dream home from somebody calling themselves The Watcher. With the ending being relatively open-ended, I thought I'd recap, break down, and explain all that there was to take away from this series. So let's get into it. Here is The Watcher Ending Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. From the moment that the show began, it had us as the audience guessing who was the Watcher in question after we were introduced to all of the main suspects. And the reality is, it's left up to interpretation due to the fact that the real-life case is unsolved. So the show itself stayed true to the outcome of reality. And despite not pointing the finger at a direct individual, it did point the finger in a certain direction despite the fact that it finished holding the aim of blame at most people. I'll break this video down into different sections. Who is the Watcher? The demise of the mental state of Dean was something that was extremely present throughout the show, as it appeared as though it was impacting him the most. He got to a point where he was obsessed with cracking the case of who was sending him the letters. So much so that he started sending letters to his former neighbors once they moved out, and also a letter to his own house when he was in desperate need. However, right at the end we saw that Dean was in therapy, and despite his family moving on and pushing what occurred in the past year into the past, naturally he gravitated towards the topic of the house due to all of the pain and suffering that it had caused him. So much so that in the final part of the show we saw him talking with the new owner of the house, where he stated that he would definitely be seeing him again. He then got in the car, adjusted his mirror to ensure that he'd see him getting a letter out of his mailbox, and then proceeded to lie to his wife about where he was. So the immediate ending was insinuating that it could well be Dean who was behind the letters, but that's something that I just don't really think is the case. I think this ending was more showing the obsession that Dean now had with the house, and how it had single-handedly destroyed his life. In losing his job, as we heard he had to go to an interview, and his mental state was not in the position that it was in at the start of the show. Even though in terms of his own personal life it was in the mud, his family life wasn't as bad as what it had seemed, and the family were essentially back where they started. All he needed to do was forget about the house, and it was something that he just couldn't do. We know that Dean was capable of sending letters to the house, and also having similar handwriting, but he only ever sent letters for his own personal gain, in order to trigger a response from his wife, or to provoke the neighbors. Tormenting a new resident of the house wouldn't make sense for him or his motives. I think that in the TV show, the Watcher was in fact a persona that was carried out and upheld by a group of individuals that were known as the Westfield Preservation Society. Pearl, Jasper, and John were all as suspicious as each other, and I believe the fact that they were all part of a society would prove that they were as heavily as involved as each other. Mo joined at the end, so it's hard to say whether or not she was directly involved. However, she was extremely suspicious. Pearl had lived there for the longest out of them all, and we saw that John was in fact sent these letters when he was in the property in '95, which leads me to think that it was her behind this trouble. So I think that she's the individual who's essentially the mastermind behind it all, and over time she's gradually recruited other people into it. We heard them each reference that they would be watching at some point when conversing with John or Nora, which I think is a subtle nod to the fact that it's a collective. The fact that we also saw John and Pearl in the tunnel is also proof of that. I think the collective work as one in order to drive an individual out of the property if they deem them to be the people that are going to change the style of a property, or if they don't fit into the dynamic of the neighborhood. Why did Theodora lie to Dean about being the Watcher? In the final episode of the show, we saw that Theodora, who was Dean's private investigator, was succumbing to her illness, and with the case looking like it wasn't going to be solved, we saw her inform Dean that she was in fact the person who was behind sending all of the letters and was the Watcher. However, it turned out that she actually made up a story saying that she was the previous owner of the house and that she sold it so that she'd be able to pay for some treatment. But after the sale went through, she found out that her husband, who passed away, had over $1 million that she was set to inherit. So the letters were her way of driving the family out of the house and being able to eventually buy it back. However, at her funeral, we saw that the story was in fact made up. But why? Well, it all tied back to the first time that she met Dean. She told the story about when her marriage fell apart, but after getting sober, she got back with her husband. But there was one condition, and it was to never ask about the woman that he'd been with. But eventually, how not knowing was something that was eating her up until she eventually found out for herself. She knew how not knowing something can take over an individual's life and drive them to the point of insanity, and she saw that this was something that was happening to Dean with the situation of the identity of the Watcher, so she decided to put him out of his misery. And although it would tarnish his memory of her, it would have in turn allowed him to have put it to bed, had closure, and been able to move on without it destroying his life anymore. So she did it out of kindness to him. We also saw that she did it because she couldn't face dying and not solving the final case that she took on, so she made up an ending for herself as well. However, I believe it's more the reasoning behind the not eating up of Dean's sanity. Was Roger aware of John Graff? In the final episode of the show, we saw that Roger, who we saw loved old homes since he was a young boy and was the founder of an Ode to a Home, was included in the Preservation Society. And it was here where we saw that John, who previously murdered his family 20 years ago, was living under the identity of William. Roger stated that he recognized William and asked him how his family was. I believe that Roger knew of the true identity. When he asked him how his family was, he looked at him with a look that insinuated that he truly recognized him. And with the look that he received back that was relatively straight-faced, followed by Jasper banging on the hammer out of trauma as he witnessed the events back in the 90s, to me it seemed like a haunting revelation, and an extremely specific question to ask. Overall review. I thought this series was enjoyable to watch. 7 episodes was the perfect amount of episodes to hold, and with them all being around 45 minutes long, it was extremely digestible. The first episode really set the tone, and I feel the transitions between scenes and time periods, which contained multiple jumps and were extremely abrupt, was a great stylistic choice to include. There was so much guessing throughout the show, so I constantly felt engaged, and this was due to there being multiple suspects for it to have been. But just like in reality, we don't know, and we may never know, so it stuck true to the current outcome. I thought the delivery of the main characters was really good, seeing Nora question what was going on, fearing for her life, her family, and her husband, but taking over and being the person who was on top financially was an interesting journey for the character. And also seeing Dean lose everything that he'd worked for in his career and slowly mirroring the behaviours of John and Andrew who had previously lived there was haunting to watch and was extremely clear to see. The score behind the scenes was something that I feel really added to this show too. The eerie nature to it really matched the tone and experience that the creators of the show would have wanted us to have gone through. The supporting cast members that played Pearl, Jasper, Mitch, Mo, and John were haunting to watch, and provided characters that you'd quite literally be petrified of if they lived in the neighbourhood and were behaving like that. I'd recommend giving this show a watch because it provides a real experience and is 7 episodes of an eerie watch. So, there you have it, The Watcher Ending Explained. If you want to see more videos such as Endings Explained, Theories and Predictions, and Character Breakdowns, then click on the I button, or alternatively you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. If you'd like to give me a show or movie that you'd like me to review, then head over to my Twitter, @brainpilot_, and tweet me what show or movie you'd like me to review next. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rate the latest movies that don't quite make the cut to getting a dedicated video, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. It's where I rate the latest releases in real time. What did you think of this show? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.